Tonight we slip quietly into the shadowy courtyards of Topkapi Palace, where moonlight glitters on marble fountains and the faint rustle of wings echoes across tiled halls. You're not sneaking into a treasure vault filled with jewels or silks, though, trust me, those are there too. You're edging towards something even stranger, the first Ottoman menageries. Imagine cages of lions glaring at you through torchlight, cheetahs chained near peacocks, and, somewhere among them, the flutter of bright green and red feathers. Parrots, squawking in languages no one in the palace fully understands, have just arrived. And, yes, if you were actually wandering here in the 15th century, you probably wouldn't survive more than a few steps past the guards, so good luck with that one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the echoing corridors where torches flicker against Iznik tiles. The Ottomans, practical warriors at heart, weren't originally big on keeping exotic animals. Early sultans like Mehmed II collected them partly to show the empire's reach, an empire stretching from the Balkans to Anatolia and, soon enough, across 3 continents. Historical records note that his palace menagerie already included leopards, tigers, and even a rhinoceros at one point. But tucked between these intimidating beasts, the softer, feathered arrivals started making an impression. Think of it, the 15th century was a time when European courts flaunted falcons, hunting dogs, and sometimes monkeys. But in Topkapi, parrots made their appearance with a charm unlike any growling predator. Their value wasn't just their bright plumage, it was their voices. A lion might symbolize strength, but a parrot could mimic a vizier's scolding tone or repeat a sultan's command in miniature. That was power with a sense of humor. Mainstream history tells us Mehmed II, known for conquering Constantinople in 1453, had wide interests. He collected Italian paintings, Greek manuscripts, and even Byzantine relics. Why wouldn't he also keep parrots, those tiny, squawking diplomats from distant lands? Some scholars suggest he received them as tribute from merchants traveling through Alexandria or the Red Sea routes. After all, Ottoman Istanbul became a hub where African and Indian trade networks collided. And here's a quirky tidbit. Early travel accounts mention not just parrots but also cockatoos appearing in Mediterranean courts, possibly brought all the way from Southeast Asia via spice traders. Imagine the sheer confusion of an Ottoman guard hearing a snow-white cockatoo screeching in the middle of the night, convinced it was some cursed jinn hiding in feathers. Historians still argue whether the menageries were purely for spectacle or had deeper diplomatic significance. Were the animals mostly entertainment, or did they symbolize dominion over nature and far-off lands? The debate continues, because records mix fact with travelers' tall tales. One Venetian visitor might exaggerate a palace filled with endless beasts, another might barely mention the animals at all. You pause near a row of cages where parrots cling to their perches, tilting their heads at you with unsettling intelligence. The air smells faintly of hay, fruit peel, and animal musk, a cocktail of odors that even the palace perfumers couldn't quite mask. Servants shuffle by carrying trays of dates and figs, tossing scraps into cages while avoiding claws and beaks. Somewhere above, the night breeze stirs the treetops in the palace gardens, mixing the rustling leaves with a sudden burst of parrot chatter. It's oddly comforting and absurd at once. These birds, dragged from jungles thousands of miles away, are now palace residents in Istanbul, perched within earshot of the world's most powerful man. The irony isn't lost on you. While Ottoman soldiers march with muskets and cannons, their sultan is quietly amused by birds that say hello in broken Turkish. And here's your first joke for the night. Imagine being a court translator, fluent in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Turkish, only to be outshone by a bird who can say bring coffee in all 4. The menagerie itself becomes a place of spectacle, where visiting envoys are led past cages not just to see power but to feel slightly unnerved. A Persian ambassador might bow before the Sultan, but behind him a parrot shrieks, mocking his accent. Coincidence? Maybe. Carefully trained entertainment? Possibly. Either way, it works. You drift further into the courtyard, feeling the cool marble beneath your feet, and realize the parrots are more than decoration. They're precursors to a full-blown craze that future sultans will embrace with obsession. For now, though, they're just settling in, colorful, loud, and out of place among lions and panthers. Their story is only beginning. And so is yours tonight. You step deeper into the palace grounds, and now the parrots are no longer background noise, they've become center stage. By the time you brush past another tiled courtyard, you realize some sultans didn't just tolerate parrots, they adored them. Picture a ruler who commands armies, levies taxes across continents, and negotiates with kings, and then spends his evenings chuckling at a bird repeating his sneeze. Welcome to the paradox of power. One of the first Ottoman rulers to really lean into the parrot craze was Bayezid II, son of the famous Mehmed the Conqueror. Bayezid had a reputation for being calmer than his father, less obsessed with conquest and more interested in art, libraries, and yes, animals. Historical records mention that his court had expanded aviaries, and travelers described seeing brightly feathered birds among them. The parrots stood out not only for their plumage but also for their ability to mimic speech, which fascinated a court already skilled in calligraphy and poetry. Now, here's a mainstream fact. Parrots were viewed across many cultures as luxury pets for the elite. Ancient Persians kept them, so did Indian princes. The Ottomans, plugged into all those trade routes, simply continued the tradition but with their own twist. Instead of just keeping parrots for show, some sultans grew personally attached. A few accounts even hint that parrots were allowed to flutter around chambers rather than staying locked in cages all day. Imagine walking into a throne room, nervously bowing, while a scarlet macaw swoops overhead like some feathery bodyguard. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. There are scattered stories of sultans who believed parrots carried luck, almost like feathery talismans. One rumor claims that if a parrot spoke a sultan's name in a clear voice, it was a sign of divine favor. That's a lot of pressure for a bird who just wanted a grape. Historians still argue whether these colorful tales reflect reality or exaggerated traveler gossip. Some scholars insist the Ottoman court was far too formal to let parrots flap around royal chambers. Others argue that Ottoman rulers were notorious for their eclectic tastes, and if a sultan wanted parrots perched on golden stands next to his throne, well, no one dared say otherwise. You picture Bayezid leaning back on embroidered cushions while a parrot, trained by a patient servant, squawks something resembling a verse of Persian poetry. Courtiers exchange nervous glances. Do they clap politely for the bird? Do they pretend not to notice? Bayezid, meanwhile, probably grins like a child at a puppet show. And that's your second joke of the night. Imagine the vizier rehearsing serious policy briefings only to be interrupted by a bird yelling coffee in a perfect bureaucratic monotone. The fascination wasn't just for amusement. In Ottoman Istanbul, having exotic pets signaled wealth and control over far-flung trade. Parrots didn't come from local woods, they came from jungles in India, Africa, and beyond. Owning them was proof that Ottoman ships and merchants could reach anywhere. For a sultan, showing off a rare bird was a subtle way of saying, "See? Even the tropics answer to me." The sensory world of these palace aviaries must have been overwhelming. Imagine polished brass cages, each studded with gemstones or hung from carved cedar beams. Fruit peels littered the floor, mixing with the scent of rosewater sprinkled around the room. Parrots shrieked in overlapping tones, one mocking a guard's cough, another imitating the splash of a fountain, and a third, just for fun, inventing nonsense syllables that sound suspiciously like insults. By now, you realize some sultans didn't see parrots as background decorations, they were companions. Lonely hours in vast palaces could be softened by a bird who chattered back. The harem women might whisper behind latticed screens, but the sultan had a parrot repeating every secret it overheard. Not that the bird knew what it was saying, but hey, that didn't stop courtiers from nervously listening in. And here's your third joke for tonight. You think you've got trust issues? Try running an empire when even your pet bird is spilling palace gossip word for word. Step by step, the Ottomans' fascination with parrots deepens. What began as a curiosity in a menagerie turns into something more personal, playful, and politically charged. The rulers with bright feathers perched beside them aren't just playing with pets, they're setting the stage for a courtly obsession that will flutter across decades. The palace is awake before dawn, and you can almost hear the shuffle of slippers on marble floors, the clang of a bronze water jug, and, of course, the sudden shriek of a parrot yelling something very impolite in broken Turkish. This time, though, the bird isn't a casual pet. It's a diplomatic weapon. You find yourself in the middle of a court audience where ambassadors shuffle nervously, carrying more than letters or jewels. They bring feathers. Parrots became high-stakes gifts. For foreign emissaries, presenting one was like saying, "Here, Majesty, I've brought a tiny slice of the distant world just for you." Portuguese traders arriving from India, they knew parrots with blue and yellow plumage could sweeten negotiations. Venetian merchants, they sometimes brought African greys, prized for their uncanny speech. These birds weren't cheap souvenirs, they were tools of persuasion. Mainstream fact here, giving exotic animals as diplomatic gifts was common across empires. The Mamluks of Egypt once gifted a giraffe to the Medici family in Florence. The Ottomans were no different. An envoy might arrive with a jewel-encrusted sword in one hand and a cage containing a sulky parrot in the other. Both were expected to dazzle. But here's the quirky tidbit. A few records suggest that parrots sometimes upstaged the ambassadors themselves. Imagine spending weeks polishing your speech in Persian or Italian, only for the Sultan to burst into laughter when the bird croaks out bread louder than you. One chronicler even hints that an African grey gifted by a Venetian diplomat became so favored by the Sultan that the poor ambassador got less credit for the treaty than his bird. Talk about being upstaged by your plus one. Historians still argue whether these parrots really altered diplomacy or whether they were just colorful distractions. Some scholars insist they softened tensions, offering an easy icebreaker in stiff negotiations. Others think the birds were little more than luxury tokens, like fine silk or a rare spice. Either way, the visual of two bearded diplomats sweating in their robes while a parrot screeches nonsense in the background is irresistible. Picture the moment. You're standing in the great audience hall, the imperial council chamber. The Sultan sits on a cushioned divan beneath a canopy embroidered with gold thread. The ambassador approaches, bows low, and presents a cage. Inside, a parrot blinks its intelligent eyes and says something almost, but not quite, coherent. The court erupts in murmurs. Is it a blessing? Is it an insult? Did the bird just say figs? And there's your first joke of this section. Imagine being an ambassador whose career depends on a parrot not blurting out something embarrassing. You'd be bribing that bird with grapes all the way from Venice. The sensory details of these diplomatic presentations are vivid. The clink of gold coins as gifts are weighed, the rustle of silk robes, and above it all the sudden flash of green wings or the metallic squawk of a parrot. Servants hover nervously, ready to clean up if the bird decides to relieve itself on the priceless Persian carpet. Not exactly the dignified moment the envoy hoped for. These feathered gifts also carried symbolism. A parrot from the east meant control of trade routes. A bird that spoke a foreign tongue hinted at unity or mockery, depending on how you heard it. For the Ottomans, every parrot reinforced their image as the empire at the crossroads of the world. If you wanted your bird to be admired by the Sultan, you had to have access to the farthest corners of the map. And here's your second joke. Somewhere out there, a desperate merchant probably tried to pass off a very colorful pigeon as a parrot, hoping no one in Istanbul noticed. Spoiler, they noticed. Some accounts even suggest parrots were paired with other luxury gifts, say, a cage accompanied by a small bag of rare peppercorns. The parrot squawks while the pepper makes everyone sneeze, creating a sensory overload that stuck in memory long after the envoy left. The debates among historians keep fluttering. Did parrots genuinely sway political outcomes, or were they just memorable accessories in ceremonies already decided by power and coin? The truth, as always, may be both. What is certain is that in the Ottoman court, gifts of parrots became legendary. Envoys remembered them. Chroniclers wrote about them. And the parrots themselves, well, they just wanted more fruit. And here's your third joke for tonight. If parrots could write memoirs, half of Ottoman diplomacy would be footnoted with squawk, cracker, squawk. As you leave the council chamber, you notice the parrot is already being carried deeper into the palace, destined for the aviaries. The ambassador breathes a sigh of relief, treaty signed, career intact, and you realize the bird has just become part of a much larger story, one feather at a time. You step out of the audience hall and into the palace gardens, where the air feels fresher, at least until another parrot lets out a scream sharp enough to startle the peacocks. By now, you've realized that these birds weren't just local novelties. They arrived from voyages that stretched across oceans, deserts, and jungles, hauled by sailors who barely survived the trips. The Ottomans didn't just stumble across parrots, they orchestrated their arrival. Mainstream fact, Ottoman Istanbul was the nerve center of global trade. Caravans came through from the Silk Road, ships sailed in from the Red Sea, and merchants from Venice, Gujarat, and Zanzibar jostled in the same markets. Exotic birds rode along with peppercorns, ivory, and indigo dye. African greys came from West Africa, Alexandrine parrots came from India, and occasionally, after the Columbian voyages, even New World macaws fluttered into Ottoman aviaries. Each arrival told the Sultan, "Your empire reaches everywhere." Now here's a quirky tidbit. One Portuguese account claims a sailor brought a pair of bright blue macaws across the Atlantic only to discover the Ottoman palace servants had no idea what to feed them. Bananas, rice, pistachios. The birds reportedly snubbed everything until someone tossed them pomegranate seeds. Imagine the panic imperial guards hovering nervously while the most expensive parrots on earth go on hunger strike. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans actually kept American parrots regularly or whether such stories were exaggerated by European visitors. Some claim that macaws were too rare and fragile to survive the long journey, while others insist that Istanbul's status as a global hub made their presence inevitable. The debate continues, with only scattered travelogues and a few miniature paintings as evidence. You picture a ship docking at Galata, crates creaking as sailors unload spices, silks, and cages covered in cloth. Inside, a parrot squawks in a language no one here recognizes. Dock workers laugh nervously, children chase after the sound, and soon enough, the bird is whisked through crowded markets, past bakers selling sesame bread, past rug merchants shouting prices, and into the shadow of Topkapi's gates. Here's your first joke tonight. Imagine being a sailor who's battled storms, pirates, and scurvy, only to be told your most important cargo is a bird that screams every time you sneeze. The palace aviaries grew more diverse with every voyage. Some accounts suggest entire gardens were filled with elaborate cages, brass bars polished to a shine, silk covers embroidered with tulips, and tiny perches carved from fragrant sandalwood. Servants were tasked with feeding routines so strict that one slip could mean disaster. Grapes sliced carefully, walnuts cracked open, figs mashed into pulp, it was practically a royal diet plan for parrots. But beyond diet, there was the matter of travel. Parrots didn't always arrive in perfect health. Sailors sometimes clipped their wings, tied them in baskets, or stuffed them into cramped cages. By the time they reached Istanbul, they looked ragged. Yet, in the luxury of Topkapi, they recovered quickly, surrounded by fountains and pampered by caretakers who probably muttered that the birds ate better than they did. Here's your second joke. Somewhere in the palace kitchens, a cook was roasting lamb for the sultan while carefully peeling grapes for a parrot. Guess which job got more appreciation? You linger near a fountain where two parrots preen, their feathers gleaming in the sunlight. Children of the court giggle as one bird mimics their laughter. Another screeches loudly enough to echo across the courtyard, making everyone flinch. The sensory overload is real, the smell of jasmine drifting from the garden, the slap of sandals on marble, and the endless chatter of birds that never quite fall silent. All of it underscores the Ottoman obsession with proving their empire's reach. A parrot from Africa wasn't just a bird, it was a reminder that their ships could dominate the Mediterranean. A parrot from India wasn't just colorful plumage, it was proof that their caravans stretched into Asia. And if, just maybe, a macaw from Brazil fluttered into Topkapi, that was a living, breathing map of power. Here's your third joke. If Google Maps had existed back then, the Ottomans could have skipped the parrots and just pinned their trade routes, but honestly, the parrots were way more fun. Step by step, voyage by voyage, the aviaries filled. And every new bird added to the Sultan's amusement, to the envy of foreign envoys, and to the empire's growing legend. You sense it now, the parrot craze isn't just about birds anymore. It's about proving the Ottoman world was big enough to catch the wind from any direction and still bring it home in a gilded cage. By now, the palace aviaries aren't just full, they're alive with a constant stream of chatter, whistles, and outright nonsense. You drift closer and realize the parrots aren't only admired for their feathers or exotic origins. They're valued for something stranger, their talent for mimicry. In a world where courtiers guarded their words carefully, parrots repeated everything without shame. And somehow, that was entertainment. Mainstream fact first. The Ottomans prized education, language, and poetry. Calligraphy was considered a sacred art. So when parrots arrived that could mimic Turkish, Arabic, or Persian phrases, they weren't treated like noisy pets. They were almost like living toys that blurred the line between art and nature. Chroniclers mention trained parrots greeting guests with rehearsed words, or squawking bits of Quranic verses, though that last detail still makes some historians raise an eyebrow. Now for your quirky tidbit. One rumor claims a sultan had a parrot trained to mimic the cough of his grand vizier. Every time the vizier cleared his throat to announce something serious, the parrot echoed him, creating such confusion that the court burst out laughing. Was it true? Hard to say, but the image of a room full of silk-robed statesmen trying not to giggle while a parrot mocks their boss is irresistible. Historians still argue whether parrots were trained systematically by handlers or just picked up palace chatter on their own. Some insist there were specialists in charge of teaching birds phrases, like feathered tutors with grapes as pay. Others believe the parrots simply overheard enough gossip to piece together a comic routine on their own. Either way, the line between official speech and parrot parody blurred. Picture yourself seated on a low divan in the Sultan's private chamber. The lamps glow softly, incense drifts through the air, and a parrot perched on a gilded stand suddenly blurts out, "Bring coffee," in flawless Turkish. Servants scramble, courtiers snicker, and the Sultan raises an eyebrow, pretending not to be amused. Then the bird repeats it louder, this time adding a sneeze it heard earlier. Everyone cracks. Here's your first joke. Imagine a parrot shouting "raise taxes" out of nowhere and the entire palace staff instantly panicking. The sensory details are vivid. The rustle of silks, the splash of fountains, and layered over it, the chatter of birds trying their best to join in. Some mimic laughter. Others copy the creak of a door. A few, perhaps the cheekiest, imitate the Sultan's commands. The effect is eerie and hilarious at once, like living echoes bouncing through marble corridors. Not all parrots were treated equally. Some became personal favorites, living in cages decorated with gold leaf and lined with silk cushions. Others remained in the communal aviaries, competing with each other in a cacophony of squawks. The Sultan's favorites were trained more deliberately, often by servants who spent hours repeating phrases to them. Here's your second joke. Somewhere in Topkapi, a poor servant probably repeated "Long live the Sultan" 2,000 times a day just to hear the bird squawk it back once. That's job dedication, or madness. The parrots didn't just mimic for fun, they shaped palace culture. Guests who visited Topkapi often wrote about the strange experience of being greeted by birds that seemed to know their names. Children of the harem reportedly taught parrots songs and silly rhymes, turning the aviaries into noisy classrooms. Some birds became so good at mimicry that visitors swore they were spirits trapped in feathers. That brings us to the eerie side. In a society filled with mystics and scholars, some whispered that parrots were mirrors of the soul, reflecting words without thought. Others saw them as omens. If a parrot repeated a sultan's name too often, was it a blessing or a curse? Historians still debate whether these beliefs were widespread or just fringe superstitions. But in a palace already filled with omens, astrologers, and talismans, parrots easily slipped into that world of half-belief. And here's your third joke. If you ever wanted to start a rumor in Topkapi, you didn't need a court spy, you just needed to sit near the aviary and wait for the parrots to spill yesterday's secrets. As you stroll out of the chamber, the chatter of parrots follows you. Some birds call like servants, others giggle like children, and one, perhaps the cheekiest, mutters something in Persian you can't quite catch. You realize the Ottomans weren't just collecting birds, they were creating an orchestra of voices, a living comedy show where no one could predict the next line. And the Sultan, seated on his cushions, was always the audience of honor. The aviary doors creak open again, but this time you're not stepping into a chamber of stern viziers or stiff ambassadors, you're drifting into the quieter, more secretive corners of the palace, the harem. Behind latticed windows and fragrant courtyards, the women of the imperial household discovered their own delight in feathers. Parrots, it turns out, weren't only for sultans. Mainstream fact: the imperial harem wasn't just a place of leisure, it was a political machine. The women inside wielded influence through alliances, education, and motherhood. But they also needed diversions. Parrots became popular companions, partly because they could be trained, partly because they offered laughter in a world that could be tightly controlled. Miniature paintings occasionally show women with birds perched on their wrists, symbols of refinement and leisure. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Travelers whispered that some concubines kept parrots not only for entertainment but also as secret confidants. A parrot, after all, won't tell your rival what you whispered in its ear unless it decides to repeat it later at the worst possible moment. One Persian chronicler even hints at a scandal where a bird blurted out a woman's private endearment for the Sultan during a banquet, to the horror of her rivals. Historians still argue whether parrots were widespread in the harem or whether these stories are embroidered fantasies by gossip-hungry visitors. The truth likely lies in between. Exotic pets certainly reached the women's quarters, but whether they became central to life there is debated. What we can imagine, though, is the sheer joy of brightly colored birds fluttering in a sunlit courtyard, their chatter mixing with the sound of fountains and the soft strumming of an oud. Picture it: women in silk kaftans lounge on cushions, trays of sherbet and sugared almonds at their side. A parrot hops along the tiled edge of a fountain, dipping its beak into the water. Another sits on a wrist, tilting its head, waiting for a figure. The air smells of rosewater and cloves, and over the chatter of the women, a parrot suddenly shrieks a phrase it learned from a servant boy. The courtyard erupts in laughter. Here's your first joke. Imagine trying to keep a serious poker face in the harem when a parrot loudly repeats, "Don't burn the rice again," in the cook's exact voice. Parrots also became subtle symbols. In Persian and Ottoman poetry, Birds often represented love, longing, or the soul. For women of the harem, teaching a parrot a verse of poetry might feel like a secret act of artistry. Imagine a macaw reciting a line comparing the beloved's eyes to stars, comical and beautiful at once. But not everything was light-hearted. The harem was a place of rivalries. A parrot who mimicked the sultan's laugh could become a coveted treasure. A bird that refused to talk might be dismissed as useless. Whispers suggest some women even competed over whose parrot could learn the most impressive phrases, a kind of feathered talent contest. Here's your second joke. Somewhere in those courtyards, a parrot probably got stage fright, froze mid-performance, and left its owner red-faced in front of her rivals. The sensory details draw you deeper. The lattice screens filter golden sunlight into patterned shadows. The rustle of silks blends with the flapping of wings. The sweet tang of candied quince lingers on the air. And in the midst of this, parrots provide a soundtrack that is half comedy, half mystical echo. Of course, their presence also raised questions. Did parrots overhear too much? Could a bird blurt out secrets it was never meant to repeat? Historians still debate whether parrots were kept deliberately isolated from certain conversations or whether the Ottomans simply laughed off the risk. After all, what's the worst that could happen? An African grey leaking state policy during a tea party? Actually, in a palace this political, that wasn't out of the question. Here's your third joke. Imagine the Sultan trying to interrogate a captured spy, only for the parrot in the room to scream, "It was me," over and over until everyone bursts out laughing. As the women recline in their scented chamber, parrots flutter around them like living jewels, their colors brighter than even the richest caftans. For these secluded companions of the empire, the birds weren't just diversions, they were reminders of a bigger, noisier, freer world beyond the harem walls. And with every laugh, every whispered secret, and every mimicked phrase, the parrots stitched themselves into the private life of the palace. You step into a quieter corner of the palace, where the smell of ink and parchment replaces the sweet scent of sherbet. Here, artists hunch over desks, brushes poised delicately, mixing pigments of lapis blue, cinnabar red, and shimmering gold leaf. This is the world of Ottoman miniaturists, where even parrots, squawking and restless in nearby cages, found their way into the pages of imperial art. Mainstream fact: Ottoman manuscript workshops produced lavish illustrated books called muraka albums compiled for the Sultan, blending portraits, calligraphy, and scenes of palace life. Animals often appeared in these works: horses, falcons, peacocks. But occasionally, if you look closely enough, a parrot perches in the margin, painted with loving precision. Their feathers became as much a mark of imperial wealth as the gold leaf framing the scene. Here's your quirky tidbit. One album known as the Suleimaname, Book of Suleiman, supposedly included a brightly colored parrot tucked into the background of a hunting scene. Why? Scholars think the painter slipped it in as a playful flourish. In other words, even court artists couldn't resist the bird's charm and maybe their cheeky sense of humor too. Historians still argue whether these birds were painted from life inside Topkapi or whether artists copied them from imported natural history sketches circulating from Persia, India, or even Europe. Some say the accuracy of the feathers suggests real-life models. Others insist the parrots look too stylized, too idealized, to have been drawn from the squawking reality of the aviaries. Picture yourself leaning over a painter's shoulder. The room is quiet except for the scratch of reed pens and the faint rustle of pages. Then, from a cage nearby, a parrot shrieks, startling the apprentice who smudges a line of gold. The master sighs, mutters something about keeping the birds outside, and then, almost in spite of himself, dips his brush in vermilion and paints a parrot into the corner of his work. Here's your first joke. Somewhere in an Ottoman library, there's probably a miniature with a parrot that looks suspiciously like it's judging the calligraphy. For the miniaturists, parrots weren't just pretty. They carried layers of meaning. In Persian poetry, parrots symbolized eloquence and the repetition of divine wisdom. In Indian tradition, parrots appeared as storytellers in fables. When Ottoman artists included them, they weren't only recording palace pets, they were layering the Sultan's collections with symbolic depth. The sensory details are mesmerizing: powdered pigments ground by hand, the tang of gum arabic binding the paint, the shimmer of gold leaf catching candlelight. Against the parchment's soft cream, a parrot's emerald feathers blaze with impossible brightness, almost as if the bird might squawk right off the page. And here's your second joke. Imagine being a royal scribe who spent weeks illuminating the Sultan's genealogy, only for everyone to flip straight to the page with the parrot. Not every appearance was decorative. Some miniatures show parrots perched near musicians, as if listening to the rhythms of the oud and drum. Others place them in gardens, surrounded by tulips and roses, echoing the Ottoman love of pairing natural beauty with cultivated order. It's art as entertainment, but also art as record, a frozen glimpse of a fad that once fluttered through the palace. And yet, scholars debate. Were these birds truly beloved by the sultans, or were they painted because they were fashionable at the time, just like tulips or carnations? Was the miniature of a parrot meant to delight the sultan personally, or was it an artist's cheeky nod to palace gossip? The uncertainty lingers, leaving you squinting at centuries-old pages, trying to catch a hint of mischief in the tilt of a painted beak. Here's your third joke. If parrots had posed for miniatures, you can bet half the sketches were ruined by birds biting the brush. You step back from the painting table and realize something. Parrots weren't just filling aviaries, they were seeping into the empire's memory. Ink, parchment, and gold captured their fleeting presence, turning noisy palace chatter into silent art. And in that silence, the parrots live forever, still perched, still watching, still waiting to squawk across the centuries. The palace shifts again. You leave the painters behind and find yourself in a quieter, more contemplative space, the library, where scholars pore over manuscripts and mystics murmur verses by candlelight. Yet even here, the parrots have followed. Their voices seep through latticed windows, and suddenly the debate turns philosophical. What does it mean when a bird repeats your words? Mainstream fact: Islamic scholars of the Ottoman world often linked animals to lessons about God's creation. Birds in particular were loaded with symbolism. Falcons stood for nobility, nightingales for longing, and parrots for speech. A bird that could talk seemed almost miraculous, and writers compared its mimicry to the echo of divine wisdom, proof that even creation itself could recite truth. Now for your quirky tidbit. Some mystics whispered that parrots were reincarnated souls, trapped in feathered bodies, forced to endlessly repeat until their spirit learned silence. One story tells of a Sufi sheikh who claimed a parrot's chatter was really the echo of forgotten prayers. It's half theology, half bedtime ghost story, and fully the kind of thing that made palace scholars tilt their heads in fascination. Historians still argue whether such mystical interpretations were widely believed or just entertaining side debates. Some think the Ottomans treated parrots mostly as playthings, others insist their ability to speak gave them a spiritual status, especially among those who saw signs of God in everything. The truth may lie somewhere in between, half superstition, half science. Picture yourself sitting cross-legged on a carpet, incense smoke curling upward. A scholar reads from a thick manuscript, his voice calm and steady. Suddenly, from a cage in the corner, a parrot squawks back the last word. The room falls silent. Some laugh nervously. Others whisper that perhaps the bird has been touched by something greater. Here's your first joke. Imagine being a mystic trying to deliver a profound lecture, only for a parrot to yell figs in the middle of your sermon. The sensory details draw you deeper, the crackle of oil lamps, the faint sweetness of rosewater ink, and the constant interruption of feathered voices. One parrot coughs like an old man, another whistles like a servant carrying tea. The scholars can't help but weave these sounds into their discussions. Some even used parrots as metaphors in their writings. One Ottoman poet compared the human soul to a parrot in a cage, full of potential, but only able to echo what it hears, not yet free to speak its own truth. Another claimed the parrot was proof that language was not uniquely human but a gift scattered across creation. Here's your second joke: if Twitter had existed back then, parrots would have been the influencers, retweeting everything without adding context. The fascination wasn't purely mystical. Physicians of the court occasionally examined parrots, trying to understand how their throats could form human-like words. Some scribes even described their tongues and vocal cords in manuscripts, treating them as curiosities of natural science. Were parrots proof of divine mystery, or just clever biology? The debate fluttered on. And of course, there were omens. Some believed that if a parrot repeated the Sultan's name clearly, it was a sign of favor. If the bird fell silent, it could foreshadow misfortune. Did people truly believe this? Historians disagree, but given the Ottoman court's obsession with astrology and portents, it wouldn't be surprising if feathers joined the mix. Here's your third joke. Picture the poor astrologer whose carefully calculated horoscope was ignored because the Sultan's parrot just sneezed his name 3 times. You rise from the carpet, the murmurs of scholars still circling behind you. In this world of ink, incense, and quiet debate, the parrots weren't just background noise. They became symbols, mirrors, even prophets in miniature. Whether the Ottomans believed them or laughed at them, their presence blurred the line between entertainment and meaning. And as you step out into the night air, the birds are still talking, always talking, reminding you that sometimes, wisdom arrives in the strangest voices. You follow the soft echo of wings into the Sultan's private courtyards, where fountains trickle and aviaries gleam like miniature palaces themselves. This is no simple collection of cages, it's an empire of feathers, built at extraordinary cost, all to keep rare parrots comfortable. The Ottomans could be pragmatic when it came to warfare or taxes, but when it came to their beloved birds, extravagance ruled. Mainstream fact: Ottoman sultans were notorious for lavish spending on their palaces and personal pleasures. From jewel-encrusted caftans to tulip gardens lit with oil lamps, their wealth showed in details. Parrots were no exception. Gold cages, imported fruit, and even heated aviaries were part of the deal. A 16th-century traveler recorded seeing rooms in Topkapi dedicated to exotic birds, with attendants whose sole job was to fan them in summer and keep braziers lit in winter. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some parrots were fed sugared almonds and pomegranate seeds, the same delicacies offered to visiting ambassadors. Imagine being an envoy from Venice, nervously waiting your audience with the Sultan, only to see a bird enjoying your exact same snack, probably with better manners. Historians still argue whether this spending was driven by genuine affection for the birds or by the need to project imperial prestige. Were parrots beloved pets, or living symbols of Ottoman reach across the globe? The answer is likely both: an overlap of luxury and display, where even a squawking bird became a badge of power. The sensory details are overwhelming: the glint of gilt cages polished daily, the fragrance of figs split open on silver trays, the flutter of wings echoing off marble courtyards. You can almost feel the humid warmth inside the winter aviary, where attendants sprinkle water to mimic tropical air. The parrots shriek, whistle, and chatter, filling the space with a cacophony that's half chaos, half concert. Here's your first joke. Somewhere in the palace accounts, a scribe probably had to justify 200 silver coins, parrot spa expenses. The extravagance extended to architecture. Some sources suggest specially designed aviary towers at Topkapi, with latticed windows to let in light but keep predators out. Others describe freestanding birdhouses, painted and decorated almost like miniature mosques, where parrots nested under careful supervision. It wasn't just about cages, it was about creating entire feathered neighborhoods inside the palace. Even the feeding had ritual. Servants carried trays of exotic fruits, some imported at outrageous costs, mangoes from India, plantains from Africa, citrus from the Mediterranean. A single parrot might dine better than a farmer in Anatolia. And yes, you guessed it, parrots learned to beg for the good stuff, squawking until they got their pomegranate or sugar cube. Here's your second joke. Picture a servant trying to shoo away a parrot that keeps screaming more grapes in perfect Ottoman Turkish. But these expenses weren't without critics. Some court chroniclers quietly grumbled about wastefulness, especially during lean years of war or famine. Feeding rare parrots while soldiers went unpaid was not always a great look, and you can almost imagine the quiet eye rolls of accountants balancing the ledgers. Still, few dared to confront the Sultan directly. After all, what minister wanted to risk his career over a bird that could call out Padishah in front of everyone? And yet, even in their luxury, parrots played into Ottoman diplomacy. Hosting guests in a courtyard filled with rare, pampered birds was a silent flex. It whispered, "If we can import and maintain these tropical treasures, imagine what else we can command." The parrots became both pets and propaganda, chirping proof of an empire's wealth. Here's your third joke. Some poor janissary probably guarded a golden cage at night, praying no one asked why the Sultan's parrot had better housing than he did. You take one last look at the aviaries before moving on. They glitter with wealth, overflow with fruit, and echo with chatter, but beneath the noise, you sense something else. These birds weren't just kept for fun. They were woven into the empire's theater of power, where every gilded perch and sugared almond told the story of a sultan who could command even the voices of foreign skies. The palace grows louder now, not with music or official business, but with laughter. You step into the entertainment halls where jesters in bright kaftans tumble, mimic, and juggle to amuse the sultan and his court. But tonight, they're not alone. Perched on their shoulders, clinging to their hats, or fluttering clumsily across the stage are parrots, living props in the great comedy of the Ottoman court. Mainstream fact, Ottoman palaces employed jesters, known as soytar or dalkavuk, who provided comic relief during long feasts or heavy political debates. They performed skits, imitated officials, and sometimes even voiced gentle criticism under the protection of humor. Pairing them with parrots doubled the amusement. Birds could mimic words, laughter, even the call of the muezzin, to the delight of audiences. Here's your quirky tidbit. One traveler's account mentions a parrot trained to perfectly imitate the Sultan's vizier. The poor man couldn't open his mouth without everyone glancing at the bird, waiting for it to repeat him in mocking tones. Imagine the humiliation and the suppressed giggles from servants in the background. Historians still argue whether these comedic acts were scripted or spontaneous. Some believe parrots were deliberately trained to parrot, literally, embarrassing phrases. Others suggest the birds picked up gossip and caught banter on their own, then blurted it out at the worst possible time. Either way, the line between rehearsed joke and accidental truth-telling was feather-thin. Picture the scene: long banquet tables grown with roasted lamb, sherbets, and trays of candied fruit. Courtiers lean back in their cushions, drowsy from wine or coffee, when a jester bursts in, his hat jingling with bells. On his shoulder, a green parrot squawks the vizier's nickname. The room erupts in laughter, except for the vizier, who tightens his jaw and pretends not to hear. Here's your first joke. You know you've lost control of the room when the bird gets more laughs than the clown. The sensory details are everywhere: the rustle of silks, the sweet stickiness of honey cakes, the sudden shriek of wings as a parrot swoops across the hall to steal a pistachio from someone's plate. Laughter rises, music swells, and the parrots add their own wild percussion to the performance. Some parrots even became performers in their own right. There are whispers of birds trained to recite lines of poetry, timed perfectly with a jester's bow. Others could whistle tunes from the palace musicians, acting like feathered flutes in comic duets. The blending of human and animal voices blurred the boundary between performance and chaos. Here's your second joke. Somewhere, a jester probably tried to juggle parrots, only to discover the hard way that parrots don't enjoy being juggled. But humor in the Ottoman court was never only fun and games. It was also a safety valve for tension. A parrot repeating the Sultan's orders in a squeaky voice gave everyone permission to laugh without actually insulting the ruler. A bird squawking the name of a disliked official turned ridicule into entertainment without the risk of open rebellion. Parrots, in their strange way, became tiny instruments of palace politics. Of course, this didn't always go smoothly. There are stories of parrots blurting out words best left unsaid, secrets, insults, or even fragments of private conversations. Did the birds cause scandals? Some historians think so, though the evidence is fragmentary. Imagine being accused of treason because a parrot quoted you in front of the wrong person. That's court life with feathers. Here's your third joke. Being roasted by a comedian is one thing, being roasted by a parrot means you'll never live it down. As the laughter fades and the lamps burn lower, you realize these scenes were more than slapstick. They show how deeply parrots had woven themselves into palace life. No longer just exotic pets or artistic motifs, they were players in the palace theater, tiny comedians with sharp beaks and sharper timing. You leave the hall smiling, but with a thought lingering. In a court where power could crush you in an instant, sometimes the safest truths were spoken by birds. You step out of the laughter-filled banquet hall into the cool night air, only to find that word of the Ottoman parrot craze has already taken wing far beyond the palace walls. Across the seas, European courts buzzed with envy and curiosity. If the Sultan could fill gilded aviaries with rainbow-feathered chatterers, then kings and dukes from Lisbon to Vienna wanted the same. Mainstream fact: European monarchs were avid collectors of exotic animals during the Age of Exploration. The Habsburgs in Spain and Austria kept menageries, the Portuguese prized African and Brazilian parrots, and the French courtiers adored songbirds. News of the Ottoman Sultan's parrot collection spread through ambassadors' letters and travelers' tales, sparking competitive collecting. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 1555, Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, the famous Habsburg ambassador to Suleiman the Magnificent, reported not only on tulips and Angora goats but also on exotic birds in Istanbul. It's said he even sent parrots back to Europe along with plants, basically the 16th century version of bragging souvenirs. Historians still argue whether Europe's bird craze directly copied the Ottomans or whether both were simply riding the same wave of global trade. Some say the Ottomans inspired the fashion by flaunting parrots as diplomatic trophies. Others argue Europe would have fallen for parrots anyway once colonial fleets started pouring into Africa, India, and South America. Picture it: a French envoy arriving at Versailles, whispering about the Sultan's aviaries. Suddenly, Louis XIV demands not one parrot but 50, preferably in gold cages. Or a Spanish courtier insisting that their Amazonian green parrots were louder, brighter, and holier than anything the Ottomans owned. International diplomacy reduced to a parrot measuring contest. Here's your first joke. Somewhere in Europe, a parrot probably picked up enough Latin to shout etc. just to sound smarter than Ottoman parrots. But the envy wasn't just about birds. It was about prestige. When European rulers heard that the Sultan kept parrots as honored companions, they saw it as a challenge. To rival the Ottomans was to prove equal power, wealth, and reach. Thus began a feathered arms race of sorts, aviaries sprouting in European palaces, each trying to outdo the other with rare species. Trade networks fueled it all. Portuguese traders ferried parrots from Brazil and Africa, Venetians brought Indian species across the Mediterranean, and even the English dabbled in parrot imports once their colonial ventures began. Some of these birds ended up in Ottoman hands first, then in Europe, creating an odd loop of cultural exchange. Here's your second joke. If birds had passports, half the parrots in Europe would have been stamped via Istanbul. Of course, not everyone approved. Some European scholars sneered at the parrot fad as frivolous. Better to invest in libraries than parrots, they said. But then again, libraries didn't squawk compliments at you during dinner parties. And the Ottomans had shown that a single bird could be both entertainment and emblem of empire. One can imagine secret frustrations too. A European nobleman, desperate to impress his guests, unveils a parrot only for it to mutter something vulgar it picked up from the ship's crew. Laughter erupts, dignity crumbles, and somewhere in Topkapi, an Ottoman sultan chuckles without even knowing it. Here's your third joke. Parrots were the original spies. Half the gossip in Europe probably came from birds repeating what sailors said on the voyage over. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Ottoman and European courts had both embraced parrots, but the Sultan's collections always carried a heavier symbolism. In Europe, parrots were exotic pets. In Istanbul, they were both living trophies and hints of mystical meaning, tied to empire and spiritual musings. The rivalry, though, kept feathers flying on both sides. As you walk along the palace terrace, you can almost hear it, a chorus of wings stretching from Istanbul to Madrid, from Venice to Paris. The parrots became more than birds, they became a shared obsession, proof that empires, despite wars and rivalries, sometimes mirrored each other in the strangest, squawkiest ways. You drift now into a quieter, more poetic corner of the Ottoman world, where the parrots have slipped out of gilded cages and onto the tongues of poets. Here, verses flow like sherbet, comparing the voice of a beloved to a parrot song, or teasing rivals by calling them birds who only repeat what others say. In the shadows of courtyards and coffee houses, parrots became metaphors, gossip, and even scandal. Mainstream fact: Ottoman poetry often used animals and nature as rich metaphors. The nightingale symbolized longing, the rose embodied beauty, and the parrot, with its unusual gift of speech, stood for eloquence, repetition, or the sweet voice of a lover. Parrots appeared in divans, collections of poems recited before audiences who knew the symbols by heart. Here's your quirky tidbit. One court poet supposedly compared a jealous rival to a parrot in a cage, bright feathers, endless chatter, but no real freedom. It was a polite way of roasting someone without saying their name, and the audience likely laughed behind their cups of coffee. Historians still argue whether parrots were truly common in Ottoman poetry or whether we overemphasize a handful of surviving references. Some scholars say the birds were fashionable images for a century or two, then faded from verse. Others insist they lingered quietly, hidden in allegory, long after the menageries themselves declined. Picture yourself at a gathering in a smoky coffee house. Musicians pluck lutes in the background, and a poet stands to recite. His voice is smooth, rising and falling as he compares the beloved's laughter to a parrot's mimicry. The crowd chuckles, half in appreciation of the wordplay, half because someone's parrot outside just squawked at the wrong moment. Here's your first joke. Nothing ruins a love poem faster than a real parrot yelling "feed me" mid-verse. Parrots also showed up in rumor and palace gossip. Courtiers whispered about birds that repeated phrases they shouldn't have, snippets of pillow talk, private complaints, even half-finished prayers. Some of these tales surely grew in the telling, embroidered like folk stories, until parrots seemed less like pets and more like feathered gossips eavesdropping on everyone. Imagine a harem chamber late at night, women chatting softly, only for a parrot to suddenly mimic the Sultan's voice. Gasps, laughter, maybe even nervous silence. Did the bird overhear something important? Was it an omen, a trick, or just proof that parrots love to stir trouble? Here's your second joke. Parrots were basically the palace rumor mill with wings and zero discretion. Even outside the palace, parrots became curiosities in stories. Travelers claimed they overheard birds scolding servants, repeating prayers, or blurting out insults that no one dared say aloud. Some rumors painted parrots as lucky charms, others as spies of mischief. Whether true or not, the stories spread, feeding into the mystique of the Sultan's collection. And of course, poets leaned into that mystique. Some likened parrots to storytellers of the East, weaving tales as endless as Scheherazades. Others used them as symbols of vanity, beautiful, yes, but forever echoing someone else's words, never their own. A sly metaphor for courtiers who flattered the Sultan too eagerly. Here's your third joke. If you've ever worked in an office, you know the type, someone repeating the boss word for word. Basically, a parrot in a suit. You leave the coffee house, the taste of strong, bitter carve still on your tongue, and the echoes of poetry following you. In the end, the parrots were never just birds. They were voices that slipped into art, rumor, and love. Sometimes mocking, sometimes flattering, sometimes just squawking nonsense, but always impossible to ignore. The palace feels quieter now. As you wander back through the courtyards, the once bustling aviaries seem thinner, the laughter of jesters less frequent, and the bright feathers less dazzling in the shadows. The parrot craze, once as loud as the birds themselves, begins to fade. Mainstream fact: by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Ottoman court shifted its spending and attention. Military campaigns, changing fashions, and the infamous tulip era redirected imperial extravagance toward gardens, flowers, and architecture. The expense of maintaining aviaries full of exotic parrots no longer seemed worth it, especially when wars with Austria and Russia drained the treasury. Here's your quirky tidbit. There are hints in some palace records that leftover parrot cages were reused for nightingales and canaries once parrots became unfashionable. Imagine a little yellow songbird rattling around inside a cage once built for a feathered diva that dined on mangoes. Historians still argue whether the decline of the parrot fad was sudden, like a fashion that collapsed overnight, or gradual, with one sultan after another quietly cutting bird budgets. Some claim the death of certain particularly beloved parrots marked turning points. Others believe the craze dwindled as parrots aged and no one bothered to replace them. Picture yourself in a fading aviary. Dust gathers on once gilded perches, a few tired birds mutter half-remembered words, and the scent of fruit no longer perfumes the air. Servants sweep, but fewer trays are brought in. The echoes of laughter and squawks feel like memories hanging in the rafters. Here's your first joke. You know the fad is over when even the parrots start yawning through their routines. The decline didn't just happen inside Topkapi. Across Istanbul, ordinary households that had once imitated the court by keeping small parrots or parakeets turned back to more practical pets. Cats returned to their throne as the city's favorite companion, while parrots became rare novelties again, their cost too high for common folk. In some ways, the decline was inevitable. The Ottoman Empire itself was changing. Trade networks shifted. Wars were more pressing than menageries. The tulip era brought tulip festivals, floating lanterns, and poetic garden parties, while parrots slowly fluttered out of fashion. Here's your second joke. At least tulips don't squawk at you when you're trying to nap. But even in decline, the memory of parrots lingered. Poets still referenced them occasionally. Scholars still mused about their voices. And travelers still wrote home about the strange fact that the Sultan's court had once adored these noisy birds. The feathered obsession faded, but it never fully vanished. Some scholars think the decline itself carried symbolic weight. The parrots represented an age of showy confidence, a court that could afford to spend wildly on whimsy. Their disappearance reflected a more sober empire, preoccupied with survival. Whether true or not, the story of the parrot's decline reads almost like the empire's own arc, brilliant, noisy, then quieter as time wore on. Here's your third joke. Somewhere, an old parrot probably muttered "remember the good old days," while pecking at a stale fig. You walk out of the aviaries for the last time, and though the halls feel emptier, you realize something. Fads may fade, but echoes remain. In every corner of Topkapi, from dusty cages to faint scribbles in ledgers, you still catch the ghostly sound of wings and voices. The parrots might be gone, but their chatter clings stubbornly to the palace stones. You find yourself in a dim, musty chamber far from the glitter of fountains and aviaries. Shelves groan under the weight of leather-bound registers, dusty scrolls, and yellowing manuscripts. The parrots are no longer here in flesh and feather, but in ink and memory. This is where their echoes survive in archives, travelogues, and forgotten notes tucked between royal decrees. Mainstream fact: Ottoman scribes were meticulous record keepers. Palace accounts listed everything from jewels to spices to, yes, exotic animals. The archives of Topkapi Palace preserve references to purchases of cages, food, and attendance for parrots, though often buried among endless lists of figs, incense, and textiles. These fragments are the breadcrumbs modern historians follow to reconstruct the craze. Here's your quirky tidbit. One record supposedly lists 2 parrots, one green, one red, delivered by Venetian trader. Nothing else, no fanfare, no story, just parrots quietly logged between a shipment of musk and saffron. It's the bureaucratic equivalent of writing "oh," and 2 screaming birds showed up today. Historians still argue whether we should take such records literally. Were they evidence of vast aviaries, or just a handful of birds kept as curiosities? Some scholars believe travelers exaggerated the scale of the Sultan's collections to impress European readers. Others argue the dry ledgers prove the birds were far more integrated into court life than outsiders realized. The truth, as always, may sit in the gap between myth and bookkeeping. Picture yourself hunched over a crumbling ledger, the ink faded but legible. You run your finger along the line where parrots appear, imagining the servant who delivered them, the scribe who dipped his pen, the sultan who maybe never even noticed the transaction. History here is quiet, almost too quiet until you remember that once, these lines represented living, squawking chaos. Here's your first joke. Somewhere in those archives is probably an angry memo: "Stop teaching parrots to mock the vizier." Beyond the ledgers, travelers' tales also preserve hints. A Venetian merchant gushes about jewel-colored parrots fluttering through the palace gardens. A French envoy exaggerates, claiming the Sultan had hundreds of birds trained to recite poetry. An English visitor complains about the deafening noise outside his chamber window. Which accounts are true? Hard to say. But together, they weave a patchwork of memory. The sensory details shift here. Instead of bright feathers and sugary fruit, you inhale the dry tang of parchment and old wood. You hear the faint squeak of book bindings instead of squawks. The parrots have transformed into shadows, still vivid, but flattened into text, waiting for someone like you to bring them back to life with imagination. Here's your second joke. If parrots could write, the archives would just be endless pages of "Who's a pretty bird," repeated for centuries. Some manuscripts go further, slipping parrots into art and allegory long after the birds themselves declined. Illuminated albums show parrots perched among flowers, or tucked discreetly into the margins of royal hunts. Even if the aviaries emptied, the artists and poets kept the birds alive on vellum. And yet, debates continue. Were these images nostalgic tributes to a lost fad? Or did they hint at secret collections maintained by later sultans, hidden away from public display? Historians don't agree. The parrots in the archives refuse to tell their full story, leaving gaps filled only by speculation. Here's your third joke. Somewhere, a historian probably spent years studying these records, only to realize half the parrot entries might have been mistranslations of pear. As you close the dusty ledger, you understand something. History doesn't always roar. Sometimes it lingers as a whisper, a scribble in a margin, or a half-forgotten rumor in a traveler's diary. The parrots may no longer fill the palace with sound, but in the archives, they still murmur, quiet, patient, waiting to be heard again. The palace is nearly silent now. You step outside, where the Bosphorus glitters under moonlight, and the city hums in the distance. The parrots are gone from the aviaries, gone from the banquets, gone from the harem chambers. Yet if you listen closely, you catch echoes, fragments of wings, whispers of voices that seem to linger in the air of Istanbul itself. Mainstream fact: today, Istanbul still has traces of its parroted past. Travelers sometimes note rose-ringed parakeets darting through city parks, descendants, perhaps, of escaped pets centuries ago. While historians can't prove they link directly to the Sultan's collections, the thought that some green flashes in the trees carry imperial ancestry adds a touch of romance to modern life. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the bazaars of Istanbul, shopkeepers sometimes hang cages of parrots at the entrance, letting them chatter to lure customers. It's half advertisement, half tradition. Some say it's a faint echo of the time when parrots were the ultimate status symbol of Ottoman power. Historians still argue whether the memory of parrots has been overplayed in storytelling. Were they truly central to palace culture, or just one eccentric detail among many? Some scholars caution against exaggeration. Others embrace the legend, pointing out that even if the parrots were only a passing fad, they left a colorful mark on poetry, art, and imagination. Picture yourself wandering through modern Istanbul. A ferry cuts across the strait, gulls wheel overhead, and somewhere in a park you hear a sharp squawk that doesn't sound like any seagull. You glance up, and for a moment, you could swear it's one of the Sultan's parrots, reborn into the city skyline. Here's your first joke. Imagine trying to explain to a modern tourist that a random parakeet in a park might be more royal than their family tree. Even if the parrots are mostly gone, the memory clings. Guides in Topkapi still point to faded miniatures where parrots perch in golden gardens. Historians still dig through dusty ledgers for entries about fruit and cages. Poets still smile when they stumble on parrot metaphors in old divans. The birds are gone, but the stories remain, fluttering in the collective memory like bright feathers caught in the wind. Here's your second joke. Istanbul may not have royal parrots anymore, but you'll still find plenty of chatterboxes in the tea houses. The sensory world of the parrots may have faded, but the idea of them still shimmers. The glitter of cages, the sweetness of figs, the shriek of feathers echoing through marble halls. They remain a symbol of a time when the empire could indulge in eccentric luxuries, when rulers could command not only armies but the voices of distant jungles. Here's your third joke. Somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the palace, a parrot is probably still muttering "Bring me grapes" after 300 years. And so you stand at the edge of the Bosphorus, listening to the mingling sounds of past and present. The parrots are gone, but their echoes linger not in cages, but in history, art, and imagination. Now the noise softens, the colors fade, and the pace slows. The parrots that once filled palaces with shrieks and laughter fold their wings, their voices dwindling into silence. You drift away from the glittering cages and banquet halls, away from the crowded gardens and painted manuscripts, and toward the gentle hum of the night. The Bosphorus glimmers, its waves sliding like silk under the moonlight. The marble courtyards of Topkapi grow quiet, shadows stretching long and still. What was once noisy and dazzling is now only memory, a faint shimmer of feathers in the corner of your mind. You can almost hear one last squawk, playful and teasing, before even that dissolves into the background hush. Let your breath slow here, matching the rhythm of the water against stone. Picture yourself lying on a soft carpet, the air cool, the windows open just enough for a breeze. No more bustling servants, no more chatter from the aviaries, only the sound of distant gulls and the faint rustle of leaves. The world becomes calm, steady, soothing. You realize that even the most extravagant obsessions fade, but what remains is gentler, a sense of wonder, a flicker of laughter, a trace of color that lingers long after the noise has ended. The parrots have flown on, yet their echoes, bright, playful, fleeting, still remind you that history is full of strange joys worth remembering. So let the feathers drift away into the night sky. Let the palace dim, its lamps extinguished one by one. Let yourself rest, your mind light, your body sinking deeper into stillness. The parrots are quiet now, and in their silence, you are free to dream.